Woman discovers freezing German shepherd tied to a tree. What she did next was unbelievable. The night was brutal, the kind that turned breath into ice the moment it left the lungs. The wind roared through the barren trees, rattling their branches like skeletal fingers. Snow blanketed everything in an eerie silence, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent flurries spinning through the darkness. Mia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she focused on the desolate road ahead. The headlights barely cut through the thick snowfall, illuminating nothing but an endless stretch of white and shadows. She shouldn't have been out this late, not in a storm like this. Every weather report had screamed warnings. Stay indoors, avoid travel, dangerous conditions ahead. But she had ignored them all. She was just minutes from home when it happened. A sound. It was faint, nearly lost in the howling wind, but it was there. A sharp, pitiful cry carried through the trees. Mia's foot hesitated on the gas pedal. Had she imagined it? Could have been the wind, or an animal, maybe even the creaking of an old branch under the weight of the ice. But then it came again. A whimper, weak and desperate. Her heart pounded. There was something out there. She slowed the car, her breath fogging up the windshield as she rolled down the window. The cold bit at her skin instantly, but the sound was clearer now. A cry for help. A plea. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't a person, it was something else. An animal. A dog. For a brief moment, every instinct told her to ignore it. It was late. The storm was getting worse. The roads were dangerous. But the thought of driving away while something suffered out there, it made her stomach twist. With a deep breath, she pulled over and cut the engine. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, and stepping into it felt like walking into an ice chamber. The wind sliced through her coat, seeping into her bones. She pulled her hood tighter and took a hesitant step toward the woods, following the sound. The deeper she went, the louder the whimpering became. Her boots crunched over the snow, her breath quickening as the trees loomed taller, their twisted branches casting dark, eerie shadows. Then, just ahead, she saw it. A figure. A dog. Its thin body trembled violently, its fur matted with ice and snow. It was tied to a tree, the rope cutting deep into its flesh. The German shepherd barely had the strength to lift its head, but when it did, its eyes locked onto Mia's. Pleading, broken, and full of pain. Mia's chest tightened. Who would do this? The storm had raged for hours, and if she hadn't stopped, this dog wouldn't have survived the night. She had to save him. Mia's breath came out in short, visible puffs as she trudged through the thick snow, her boots sinking with each hurried step. The cold bit into her skin, but she hardly noticed. Her entire focus was on the helpless creature ahead. The German shepherd was tied to a tree, half buried in the snow, trembling violently. His once thick coat was matted with ice, his body barely able to hold itself upright. She swallowed hard. How long had he been out here? The wind howled through the empty forest, sending another wave of snow tumbling from the branches above. Mia winced as the icy flakes stung her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The dog let out a weak, pitiful whimper. That sound sent a fresh wave of urgency through her. She dropped to her knees beside him, reaching out with gloved hands. The dog flinched, his ears flattening against his head. His dark eyes, dull and lifeless, flickered with fear. But there was no aggression, no growl, no resistance, only exhaustion. Mia's heart clenched. Whoever had left him here had done so with cruel intent. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tied him to this tree and left him to die. Mia quickly assessed the situation. The rope around his neck was thick, tied in a cruelly tight knot that had already rubbed the skin raw. If he hadn't frozen to death yet, he could have easily strangled himself trying to break free. She yanked off her gloves and reached for the rope. Her fingers, already numb from the cold, struggled to loosen the knot. It was frozen solid. Ice had formed over the coarse fibers, turning it into something like steel. No matter how hard she pulled, it wouldn't budge. "Come on! Come on!" she muttered under her breath, frustration mounting. The dog let out another weak whimper, his body swaying slightly. He was fading fast. Mia's pulse pounded in her ears. She didn't have time for this. Digging into her coat pocket, she grabbed her keys. The jagged edge of one key wasn't sharp, but it was her only option. She positioned it against the rope and began sawing as fast as her numb fingers allowed. The freezing wind howled around her, biting at her exposed hands. She barely noticed. All that mattered was getting this dog loose before it was too late. The rope refused to give. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. The shepherd's breathing was growing shallower. His head dipped forward, his body beginning to slump against the tree. No, she wasn't losing him. With a final, desperate effort, she pressed down harder, the key finally slicing through the last frozen strand. The rope snapped. The dog collapsed into the snow. Mia barely had time to react. Without thinking, she lunged forward and caught him before he hit the ground completely. His body was frighteningly cold. He didn't even try to move. He just lay there, his chest barely rising and falling. "No, no, no, stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. She needed to get him warm, fast. Ignoring the burning in her arms, she scooped the dog up and stumbled toward her car. He was heavier than she had expected, all muscle even in his weakened state. Every step felt agonizing as she pushed against the knee-deep snow, but she refused to stop. Her car was parked near the edge of the forest. Too far. The weight of the German shepherd pressed down on her, and her muscles screamed for relief. But she clenched her jaw and kept going. The shepherd let out a weak sigh against her chest. His body was shaking, but his movements were slowing. That wasn't a good sign. Almost there. Just a little more. When she finally reached her car, she fumbled with the door handle, nearly dropping her keys in the process. Her hands were shaking too badly. "Come on," she muttered, forcing herself to stay calm. Finally, she got the door open and gently placed the dog in the back seat. His head lolled to the side, his dull eyes barely open. Mia turned the heat on full blast. But heat alone wouldn't be enough. Her coat was already damp from the snow, but she shrugged it off and laid it over the dog. She wasn't going to let him freeze. Then came the next problem. Where could she take him? The nearest veterinary clinic was closed at this hour. The animal shelter wouldn't take in an unregistered dog without going through procedures. She only had one option. Her home. As she sped down the empty road, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Who would do this? This wasn't just neglect. This was cruelty. Then something caught her eye. The rope she had cut free was still in the passenger seat. As she glanced at it under the dim glow of the dashboard lights, she realized something. There was something written on it. She snatched it up, bringing it closer to her face. It wasn't just a regular rope. It had been marked, in faded black ink, barely visible under the layers of frost. There was a word. Killer. Mia's stomach dropped. What did that mean? Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where the German shepherd lay wrapped in her coat. He wasn't moving much, but his breathing was steady. Was this why he had been abandoned? Had someone tied him up, leaving him to die on purpose because they believed he was dangerous? Or was this something more sinister? Mia tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. But one thing was certain. This rescue was only the beginning. The drive home was silent, except for the low hum of the heater blasting warm air into the freezing car. Mia kept glancing at the German shepherd in her rearview mirror, her mind racing. He was still curled up under her coat, his body shivering slightly, but his breathing was more stable. The warmth was working, but she knew he wasn't out of danger yet. But that wasn't the only thing troubling her. The word on the rope. Killer. The faded black ink stared back at her from the passenger seat, and her grip on the steering wheel tightened. Why would someone label a dog that way? He had been weak, cold, and terrified when she found him. Hardly the image of a dangerous animal. And yet, someone had deliberately left him to die, tied to a tree in the middle of a snowstorm. A chill ran down her spine, and this time, it had nothing to do with the cold. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Mia's thoughts were spiraling. What if there was more to this than just abandonment? What if someone had gotten rid of this dog for a reason? She shook her head. No, that didn't make sense. Even if he had a troubled past, leaving him to die like that was unforgivable. No living creature deserved that kind of fate. She stepped out of the car and carefully carried the German Shepherd into her house. He let out a low, exhausted sigh as she set him down near the fireplace. The warmth would help. She grabbed a thick blanket and draped it over him before rushing to get some towels and a bowl of warm water. As she dabbed at his fur, wiping away the ice, she finally got a good look at him. Beneath the grime and frost, he was beautiful. A strong, well-built dog with striking dark eyes that held a quiet intelligence. His coat was thick, though tangled and unkempt, and as she ran her fingers over his ribs, she could feel how thin he was. He had been starving for a long time. Then she saw something else. Scars. Not just the normal scratches a dog might get from rough play or an accident. Deep, jagged scars that ran along his side and one across his front leg. Old wounds. Some looked like burns. Mia's breath caught in her throat. What had this poor dog been through? She was still processing everything when she noticed something else. A faint engraving on his worn-out collar. The leather was cracked and faded, but she could still make out the letters. Her heart pounded as she traced the letters with her fingers. Shadow. She exhaled, a name forming on her lips. Shadow. For the first time since she found him, the German Shepherd lifted his head. His ears twitched slightly, and his eyes locked onto hers. He recognized the name. Mia's chest tightened. Someone had loved this dog once. He wasn't just a stray. He had a name, a past. So why had he been abandoned? She needed answers. Grabbing her phone, she snapped a picture of Shadow's collar and scars. Then, hesitating for only a moment, she turned the rope over in her hands and took a picture of the word, killer, scrawled across it. Something about this didn't feel right. Something told her that Shadow's story wasn't just one of simple neglect. Someone had wanted him gone, and Mia was determined to find out why. Mia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. Shadow wasn't just another abandoned dog. There was a story here, a dark one. The scars on his body, the word killer on the rope, the way he had been left to freeze to death. It all pointed to something more than just an unwanted pet. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, gently stroking his thick fur. His body had warmed up, but his eyes still held a distant pain. Who had done this to him? And why? She had to find out. The next morning, Mia started observing Shadow more closely. Now that he was no longer freezing or exhausted, she noticed little things. Things that made her even more suspicious. For one, he was highly alert. His ears perked up at the slightest sound. His body tense as if expecting something bad to happen. Whenever she moved too quickly, his eyes flicked toward her hands. Not with fear, but with calculated precision, as if he had been trained to anticipate actions. And then there was the way he moved. When she let him out into the backyard, he didn't bound around like a regular dog enjoying his freedom. Instead, he walked the perimeter, nose low, body poised. He was patrolling. A cold realization washed over Mia. Shadow wasn't just any dog, he had been trained. She had seen enough military and police K9 units in action to recognize the posture, the sharp movements, the way he scanned his surroundings. Had he belonged to law enforcement? Her heart pounded as she pulled out her phone and searched for missing police or military dogs in the area. Could Shadow have been one of them? Nothing. She expanded her search, typing in phrases like discharged K9 units and retired police dogs abandoned. Then she saw it. Determined to get more answers, Mia took Shadow to the vet later that afternoon. She needed to check his overall health, but she also hoped the vet might have a way to track down his origins. As soon as they walked into the clinic, Shadow's entire demeanor changed. His body tensed, his ears pinned back, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Mia tightened her grip on the leash, whispering, "It's okay, boy. You're safe." The vet, Dr. Harris, frowned as he took in the dog's behavior. "He's been through something," he muttered. "Let's see if he's chipped." Mia held her breath as Dr. Harris scanned Shadow's neck with a microchip reader. A beep sounded. Her heart leaped. He had an owner. He had a past. Dr. Harris pulled up the information on his computer, but as he read the screen, his face darkened. His eyes flicked toward Mia, concern written all over his face. This can't be right, he said. Mia leaned forward. What is it? Dr. Harris hesitated, then turned the screen toward her. According to this, Shadow was reported dead 6 months ago. Mia's blood ran cold. Dead? She stared at Shadow, who lay quietly on the examination table. He was very much alive. So why had someone declared him dead? Dr. Harris scrolled through the records. He was part of a security K-9 unit. But there's a note here that he was decommissioned due to an incident. His voice dropped. A violent one. Mia's stomach twisted. What kind of incident? Dr. Harris shook his head. It doesn't say. Just that he was deemed unfit for service and was supposed to be put down. Mia's heart pounded. Shadow had been sentenced to death, but someone had taken him instead. And then they had left him to die in the freezing woods. But why? Mia clenched her fists. She was going to find out. Mia's hands trembled as she shut the vet's office door behind her. The icy wind outside stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her mind was racing. Shadow had been labeled dangerous, declared dead, and yet, here he was. Someone had wanted him gone. She glanced down at the German shepherd beside her. He walked obediently at her heel, his large frame powerful yet controlled. Did this look like a killer? Mia didn't believe it. Not for a second. But she knew one thing for sure. Whoever had abandoned him in the woods hadn't just been getting rid of an unwanted pet. They had been trying to erase him. And she had a feeling she was getting too close to the truth. That night, Mia barely slept. She sat on her couch, scrolling through every bit of information she could find on Shadow's old security company. The vet's records had listed Blackridge Private Security as his previous owner. She searched the company name. Nothing. That was odd. Most security firms had websites, business listings, something. But Blackridge? It was like they didn't exist. She tried a deeper search, digging through old forums and news articles. Finally, she found a mention, an old report about a private security scandal. A company accused of using extreme force, covering up incidents, and even disposing of problematic assets. Her heart pounded. Was Shadow one of those assets? A noise outside made her jump. She turned off her phone screen and slowly walked toward the window. The street was empty, the lamplight casting eerie shadows over the pavement. Then she saw it. A black SUV parked across the street. Her breath caught. It hadn't been there earlier. She backed away from the window, her heart slamming against her ribs. Had they found her? Suddenly, Shadow stood up, his ears pricked. His body stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his throat. That's when she knew. She wasn't imagining it. Something was very, very wrong. Mia knew she couldn't stay silent. If Shadow had been part of something dangerous, she had to expose it before whoever was behind this came for him again. She grabbed her phone and started recording. She sat beside Shadow, running her fingers through his fur. "This is Shadow," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "He was found tied to a tree in the freezing cold, left to die. But what I've learned since then is even more terrifying." She went on to explain his security training, the fake death report, and the mysterious company that had erased its own existence. Whoever did this didn't just abandon him. They were trying to make sure he was never found. And now I think they know I have him. As she spoke, Shadow stayed close, his eyes scanning the room as if he could sense her fear. She posted the video. Within minutes, the comments started flooding in. People were horrified, outraged. Some even recognized Shadow's behavior, claiming he might have been involved in military experiments, illegal training, or something even worse. And then, Mia got a message. Private, anonymous account. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into. Stay out of this or you'll regret it." Mia's blood turned to ice. The next day, the SUV was gone. But the warning remained burned into her mind. Mia wasn't going to back down. She took Shadow to a local investigative journalist, someone she trusted. She handed over all the files, the video, the vet's report. If something happened to her, she wanted people to know the truth. And then the real break came. The journalist dug deep and found a whistleblower, someone who had worked for Blackridge. The truth was worse than Mia imagined. Shadow had been part of an elite attack dog unit, trained to obey without hesitation. But something had gone wrong. He had refused to follow a lethal command during an operation, one that would have hurt innocent people. He had defied his handlers. For them, a dog that wouldn't kill on command was useless. So instead of retiring him or rehoming him, they tried to erase him. Mia's stomach churned as she read the report. Shadow wasn't dangerous. He was a hero. And now, because of her, the world would know the truth. The story of Shadow spread like wildfire. Mia's video, along with the journalist's report, went viral. People were horrified by the truth. Shadow wasn't just a discarded dog. He was a hero who had been punished for doing the right thing. Animal lovers, activists, and even former security personnel started speaking up. Blackridge Private Security was under investigation, and authorities began digging into their past operations. Shadow had unknowingly exposed something far bigger than anyone had imagined. Mia started receiving messages from veterans and dog trainers. Many recognized Shadow's intelligence and discipline. Offers poured in, from experienced handlers willing to help rehabilitate him, to families wanting to give him a loving home. But Mia already knew where he belonged. For weeks, Mia had been training Shadow with patience and love. At first, he had been wary, always watching his surroundings, never fully at ease. But with time, his eyes softened, his body relaxed, and he started trusting again. One morning, Mia opened the door and stepped outside with Shadow by her side. A man stood in front of her, a retired K-9 trainer named Daniel. He had seen Shadow's story and wanted to help. "He's special," Daniel said, watching Shadow sit attentively at Mia's feet. "A dog like him doesn't just need a home. He needs a purpose." Mia nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. Daniel offered to train Shadow for search and rescue work. A new purpose, one where his intelligence and instincts would save lives instead of being used for harm. But there was only one question left. What did Shadow want? Mia knelt beside him, looking into his deep brown eyes. "It's up to you, buddy," she whispered, stroking his fur. "Do you want to go with Daniel?" Shadow looked at Daniel, then back at Mia. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, he pressed his head against Mia's chest, letting out a deep sigh, the first real sign of peace she had seen from him. Mia smiled through her tears. "I guess that's my answer." Shadow had made his choice. He wasn't leaving. Shadow's days of suffering were over. He no longer had to fight to survive. He had a home, a family, and a future. With Mia's love and Daniel's guidance, Shadow flourished. He trained as a rescue dog, using his incredible intelligence and discipline to help locate missing people in disasters. The same instincts that had once been exploited for harm were now saving lives. His story inspired thousands. People who had once feared him now admired him. He became a symbol of resilience, proof that no being, human or animal, should be discarded for doing what's right. Mia often watched him as he ran across the open fields near her home, his tail wagging, his eyes bright. He was finally free, and this time no one would ever take that away from him. Shadow's story is more than just one of survival. It's a powerful reminder of the resilience, loyalty, and unwavering spirit of animals. But his journey also exposes a harsh reality. Far too many animals are abandoned, mistreated, and left to suffer simply because they are no longer useful to humans. How many other dogs like Shadow are out there, tied to trees, left in the cold, or punished for their loyalty? The truth is heartbreaking, but it doesn't have to end in tragedy. You can be the change. Paw Prints Adopt, don't shop. If you're thinking about bringing a pet into your life, consider adopting from a shelter or rescue. Countless animals are waiting for a second chance. Just like Shadow. Paw Prints speak up against animal cruelty. If you see an animal in distress, don't turn away. Report abuse, spread awareness, and stand up for those who can't speak for themselves. Paw prints support rescue organizations. Even if you can't adopt, there are countless ways to help. Donate, volunteer, or simply share stories that raise awareness. Every action makes a difference. Paw prints cherish the animals in your life. If you have a pet, love them fiercely. They are not just animals. They are family. Their loyalty and love deserve nothing less than the same in return. Shadow's suffering ended because one woman refused to look away. Would you do the same? Let his story inspire action. Share this message, raise awareness, and help create a world where no animal has to suffer alone. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to change a life forever.